The crystal vase shattered against the marble floor, sending shards skittering across the pristine white tiles like frozen tears. I watched them scatter, my cheek still burning from the impact of Marcus's palm, the metallic taste of blood pooling in my mouth where my teeth had cut into my inner lip. "You're worthless," he hissed, his face contorted with rage, so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "A pathetic, stupid woman who can't do anything right. You can't even host a simple dinner party without embarrassing me in front of my colleagues." I stood there trembling, one hand pressed against my stinging face, the other clutching the edge of the dining table for support. Around us, the remnants of what was supposed to be an elegant dinner lay scattered: overturned wine glasses, half-eaten plates of food, napkins crumpled on chairs that had been hastily abandoned when Marcus's voice had risen to a roar. His business partners had left 20 minutes ago, their faces carefully neutral, their wives murmuring polite excuses as they gathered purses and coats with unseemly haste. But I had seen it in their eyes. The pity, the judgment, the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something they wished they could unsee. "The salmon was undercooked," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone that was somehow worse than his shouting. "Jennifer's wife mentioned it was dry, and you just stood there like an idiot, unable to even defend. You're cooking. Do you have any idea how much money I lost tonight because you made me look like a man who can't even control his own household?" Control his own household, as if I were a possession, a piece of furniture that had malfunctioned. I wanted to tell him that the salmon had been perfect, that Jennifer's wife had complimented it before Marcus had started his tirade. I wanted to scream that I had spent 3 days planning this dinner, that I had ordered the food from the most expensive caterer in the city, that I had arranged every detail exactly as he'd demanded. I wanted to remind him that I had once been someone, that before I'd become Mrs. Marcus Holloway, I had been Elena Reeves, a woman with dreams and ambitions and a life of her own. But I said nothing, because that's what I had learned to do over the past 5 years of our marriage. Stay quiet, stay small, survive. "Go to your room," Marcus said, dismissing me with a wave of his hand as if I were a disobedient child. "I don't want to see your face for the rest of the night, and tomorrow you'll call every single one of those couples and apologize for ruining the evening." I nodded, keeping my eyes downcast, and turned toward the stairs. Each step felt like climbing a mountain, my legs heavy with shame and exhaustion. Behind me, I heard Marcus pour himself another drink, the clink of crystal against glass echoing through our massive empty house. Our bedroom, my bedroom really, since Marcus had moved into the guest suite months ago, claiming he needed space to think, was at the end of the long hallway. I closed the door behind me and locked it, then walked slowly to the ensuite bathroom. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized. Dark hair, disheveled, mascara smudged beneath red-rimmed eyes, a purple bruise already blooming across her left cheekbone. This wasn't the first time Marcus had hit me. It wasn't even the 10th, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way he'd done it in front of others, not even bothering to maintain the facade of the perfect marriage anymore. Maybe it was the casual cruelty in his voice, the absolute certainty that he could do whatever he wanted to me without consequences. Or maybe it was the timing. I reached into the drawer beside the sink, pushing past bottles of expensive skincare products, gifts from Marcus, chosen by his assistant because he'd never bothered to learn what I actually liked, until my fingers found the small key taped to the back panel. I'd hidden it there 6 months ago, when I'd first realized that my marriage wasn't just unhappy, it was dangerous. The key unlocked the bottom drawer of my closet, the one Marcus had never bothered to open because he assumed it contained nothing but shoes and handbags. I knelt on the plush carpet and pulled out the locked metal box, hidden beneath a stack of evening gowns I'd worn once and never touched again. Inside the box was everything I'd been gathering for the past year. Documents, photographs, recordings, bank statements, emails, Evidence, because here's what Marcus didn't know about me, what he'd never bothered to discover in all the years we'd been together. I wasn't stupid, I wasn't weak, and I definitely wasn't the helpless trophy wife he believed he'd married. If you're watching this story, I want you to know that you're not alone. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who should protect us. But what happens next? What I'm about to reveal proves that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. If this story resonates with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and there are many more stories like this one to come. Now let's continue. People always asked how Marcus and I met, usually at the charity galas and business dinners where we played the role of the perfect couple. Marcus would tell the story with his charming smile, his hand possessively on my lower back. I saw her across a crowded conference room and knew she was the one. What he never mentioned was that the conference room had been for a tech startup pitch competition, and I hadn't been there as anyone's date or assistant. I'd been one of the presenters. 7 years ago, I was Elena Reeves, 26 years old, with a master's degree in computer science from MIT and a revolutionary software algorithm that could predict market trends with unprecedented accuracy. My startup, Helios Analytics, had been small but promising, backed by a modest angel investment and powered by my absolute belief that I could change the financial technology landscape. Marcus had been in the audience that day, one of the venture capital judges, though I hadn't known it at the time. After my presentation, he'd approached me, his eyes bright with interest, asking intelligent questions about my algorithm, seeming genuinely impressed by my work. Within a week, we were having dinner. Within a month, we were dating. Within 6 months, I was in love with a man who seemed to see me, really see me, in a way no one else ever had. "You're brilliant," he would tell me, his fingers tracing patterns on my skin as we lay tangled together in his penthouse apartment. "You're going to change the world," I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. The proposal came a year after we met, on a rooftop restaurant with a view of the city lights spread out below us like scattered diamonds. Marcus had gotten down on one knee with a ring that probably cost more than my entire startup's operating budget. And I'd said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down my face, certain that I'd found my happily ever after. The problems started slowly, so gradually that I didn't notice them accumulating until they'd formed an invisible cage around me. First, it was the suggestion that I should consider selling Helios Analytics. "You're going to be my wife," Marcus had said, his tone gentle, but firm. "You won't need to work. I can take care of you. Plus, running a startup is so stressful. Don't you want to enjoy your life instead?" I'd hesitated, but he'd been persuasive. He'd found a buyer, handled all the negotiations, assured me it was the best deal I could get. I'd signed the papers 2 weeks before our wedding, watching my dream dissolve into a bank account I'd barely touched since. Then came the wedding itself, a lavish affair that was more about Marcus's business connections than our actual relationship. I'd wanted something small and intimate, but Marcus had convinced me that a big wedding was an investment in our future, a chance to cement relationships that would benefit us both. On our honeymoon in Bali, Marcus had suggested I might want to consider changing my name professionally as well as personally. "Holloway has more weight in business circles than Reeves," he'd said. "If you ever want to consult or start something new, it'll open doors." I'd agreed, not realizing I was erasing Eleanor Reeves from existence, replacing her with Mrs. Marcus Holloway, a woman who existed only in relation to her husband. The final blow came when I'd tried to start a small consulting business from home, thinking I could at least keep my skills sharp. Marcus had exploded, accusing me of embarrassing him, of implying that he couldn't provide for me adequately. "What will people think?" he'd demanded. "That I'm not successful enough to support my own wife?" So I'd stopped. I'd become exactly what he wanted, a perfect accessory, a beautiful object that enhanced his image, a silent partner who smiled and nodded and never challenged him. But here's what Marcus never understood. Giving up my business didn't mean I'd stopped being intelligent. Staying quiet didn't mean I'd stopped observing. Playing the role of dutiful wife didn't mean I'd forgotten who I really was. I'd kept my skills current, taking online courses in secret, following developments in financial technology, staying connected to my old network through private social media accounts Marcus didn't know existed. And when the abuse started, first verbal, then emotional, then finally physical, I'd begun documenting everything with the same methodical precision I'd once used to debug code. Every slap, every insult, every threat, every instance of his cruelty, recorded and dated and stored away. Because I'd learned something important during my years with Marcus. The best revenge isn't immediate. It's patient, it's strategic, it's waiting for exactly the right moment to strike back in a way that leaves your enemy unable to recover. And that moment was finally here. The documents in my locked box told a story that would destroy Marcus if anyone else ever saw them. But tonight, as I sat on my bedroom floor with the evidence spread around me, I realized I'd been approaching this wrong. Documentation of his abuse would hurt him, certainly, but it wouldn't be enough to truly break him the way he'd broken me. Marcus cared about three things: money, power, and reputation. The abuse was about control, but control wasn't what he valued most. No, what Marcus truly loved was the image he projected to the world, the successful venture capitalist, the shrewd businessman, the man with the golden touch who turned every investment into profit. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the last year discovering exactly how he'd built that reputation. And it wasn't pretty. It had started innocuously. Enough, about 18 months ago, I'd been organizing Marcus's home office, one of my assigned duties as his wife, when I'd found a folder of documents he'd left on his desk: investment prospectuses, due diligence reports, financial projections. Out of curiosity and boredom, I'd started reading them. Something hadn't added up. The numbers in the public-facing documents didn't match the internal memos. Companies that should have been failing were being presented to investors as sure things. Risk. Assessments were being deliberately downplayed or omitted entirely. I'd told myself it was probably nothing, that I was misunderstanding the complexities of venture capital. But the nagging doubt had persisted, growing stronger every time I glimpsed another discrepancy. So I'd started looking deeper. It wasn't hard. Marcus was arrogant enough to keep most of his files on his home computer, protected only by a password I'd watched him type 100 times. He never thought to hide anything from me, because he'd never considered me a threat, just a decorative object that happened to share his house. What I found made me physically sick. Marcus's venture capital firm, Holloway Investments, was built on a foundation of lies. He'd been running what was essentially a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for years, using money from new investors to pay returns to old ones, inflating the value of failing companies on paper while quietly funneling funds into offshore accounts. He'd defrauded dozens of investors out of millions of dollars, all while maintaining the facade of a legitimate businessman. The really clever part, and I had to admit Marcus was clever in a sociopathic sort of way, was that he'd been selective about his victims. He targeted people who could afford to lose money without going bankrupt, people who would be embarrassed to admit they'd been fooled, people who valued their reputations enough to stay quiet rather than pursue legal action that might make them look foolish. It was brilliant in its way. Absolutely criminal, but brilliant. I'd spent months copying files, forwarding emails to secure accounts, photographing documents, building an ironclad case that would not only prove Marcus's fraud, but tie it directly back to him in ways that left no room for deniability. I'd used every skill I'd learned at MIT, every analytical technique I'd developed for Helios Analytics, to create a paper trail that was bulletproof. But I'd hesitated to do anything with it. Because as much as I hated Marcus, as much as I wanted to escape him, I was terrified. He had money, connections, power. He'd threatened me enough times that I knew what he was capable of. If I went to the authorities and somehow the case fell apart, if he managed to talk his way out of it or buy his way free, he would destroy me. So I'd waited, gathering more evidence, making sure everything was perfect, telling myself I was being strategic when really I was just scared. Until tonight, until he'd hit. Me in front of witnesses, demonstrating so clearly that he no longer saw any need to hide his true nature. Until I'd realized that staying silent wasn't keeping me safe, it was only making me complicit in my own destruction. I looked down at my phone, at the contact information for 3 people I'd been too afraid to call. Amanda Chen, an investigative journalist who specialized in corporate fraud. David Morrison, an SEC investigator I'd met at a charity event 2 years ago. And Sarah Price, a deadliest divorce attorney whose reputation for destroying abusive men in court was legendary. My hand trembled as I opened my encrypted email account and began typing the first message. Once I sent these emails, there would be no going back. Marcus would know what I'd done, and he would be furious, more furious than I'd ever seen him. But he would also be powerless, because by the time he realized what was happening, it would be too late. I attached the files, took a deep breath, and hit send. Then I sent the second email, then the third. Then I opened a new message and addressed it to someone I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. My old business partner from Helios Analytics, the one person who'd never given up on me, even when I'd abandoned our shared dream. James, I wrote, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I need your help. Are you still working on predictive market algorithms? Because I have some information that's about to tank several major investment portfolios, and I need someone who understands the ripple effects to help me time this perfectly. Also, I'm finally ready to talk about that offer you made 5 years ago, about buying back Helios. We need to talk tonight. By 3 in the morning, I'd received responses to all my emails. Amanda Chen wanted to meet as soon as possible. She'd been investigating rumors about Holloway investments for months and was ecstatic to finally have solid evidence. David Morrison from the SEC needed to verify my documents, but promised that if they checked out, he'd begin a formal investigation immediately. Sarah Price's response was brief but powerful. I've been waiting for years to take down Marcus Holloway. Let's make him regret ever laying a hand on you. James's response was the longest and the most emotional. He'd gone on to tremendous success after I'd left. Our algorithm had been acquired by a major financial firm, and he'd used his share of the profits to start a new venture that was currently worth over $100 million. But what struck me most was his opening line, "Elena, I never stopped believing in you. Welcome back." I cried when I read it, not tears of sadness, but of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The real kind, not the desperate variety I'd been clinging to in this house of horrors, but genuine hope that I might actually survive this, that I might become myself again. We set up an encrypted video call for 4 a.m. when I knew Marcus would be passed out drunk in the guest room. James appeared on my laptop screen, looking older but with the same kind eyes I remembered. His home office visible behind him, walls covered with whiteboards, full of complex equations and market projections. "Tell me everything," he said simply. So I did. I told him about the abuse, though I kept it brief because reliving it hurt too much and it wasn't the point. I told him about discovering Marcus's fraud, about the evidence I'd gathered, about my plan to bring him down. And then I told him what I needed: help understanding exactly how Marcus's schemes worked, assistance in predicting the cascade effect when his fraud became public, and guidance on how to protect innocent investors while ensuring Marcus couldn't escape the consequences. "This is going to be nuclear," James said when I finished, his expression serious. "When this breaks, it's not just Marcus who goes down. Every company he's invested in will be questioned. Every business partner will be investigated. The whole house of cards collapses, and a lot of people will lose money, some of them people who didn't deserve it." "I know," I said quietly, "but if I don't do this, Marcus keeps destroying lives. He's already ruined mine. How many others has he hurt? How many will he hurt in the future?" James nodded slowly. You're right. And honestly, Elena, from what you've shown me, this has been inevitable for a while. These schemes always collapse eventually. You're just controlling when and how it happens. That's actually better for the innocent investors because we can prepare them, warn the ones we can reach. We spent the next 3 hours going through Marcus's files together, James helping me understand the full scope of the fraud. It was worse than I'd thought. Marcus had been running this scheme for almost a decade, long before he'd even met me. The total amount of money he'd misappropriated was close to $50 million. There's something else, James said, as dawn began to lighten the sky outside my window. That sale of Helios Analytics 5 years ago, did you ever look at the details of what happened after Marcus sold it? I frowned. No, I couldn't bear to. Why? James's expression turned grim. Because Marcus never actually sold your company, Elena. He sold the IP rights to the algorithm, which, by the way, wasn't even fully yours to sell since I owned 49% of the company. But he kept the corporate shell, used it to funnel money through, and eventually bankrupted it, deliberately for tax purposes. He made about $3 million off the sale of your work, paid you $200,000, and kept the rest. The room seemed to spin around me. What? He committed fraud against you before you even married him, James said quietly. The sale was illegal from the start because you didn't have authority to sell my portion of the IP. I could have sued, probably should have, but I didn't want to hurt you by dragging you into a legal battle. I thought maybe you'd needed the money, that you'd made a desperate choice. I didn't realize Marcus had orchestrated the whole thing. I felt something crack inside me, the last fragment of doubt, the small voice that had been whispering that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe Marcus didn't deserve what I was planning to do to him. That voice went silent. Help me destroy him, I said, my voice steady and cold. Not just legally. I want to dismantle everything he's built. I want him to lose his money, his reputation, his freedom. I want him to feel exactly how I've felt for the past 5 years, powerless, trapped, and terrified. James studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's get to work. I spent the next 3 days playing the perfect victim, the obedient wife who'd learned her lesson. I called Marcus's business partners and apologized for ruining the dinner party, my voice appropriately meek and ashamed. I kept my head down when Marcus was home, spoke only when spoken to, flinched appropriately when he raised his voice. He loved it. I could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the smug certainty that he'd finally broken me completely. He even bought me flowers, not as an apology, but as a reward for good behavior, like you might give a dog a treat for sitting on command. That's better, he said on the 3rd night, standing in the doorway of my bedroom where I sat reading. I knew you just needed a firm hand. You've been so much more pleasant these past few days. Looked up at him with carefully cultivated fear in my eyes and nodded. I'm sorry I disappointed you. As long as you learned your lesson. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, I'm having some important investors over this Saturday. I expect you to be on your best behavior. We're talking about a major deal. Could be the biggest of my career. I need everything to be perfect. Of course, I said quietly. I'll make sure everything's perfect. He smiled, that cold, self-satisfied smile that had once seemed confident but now just looked cruel, and left. The Saturday dinner he'd mentioned was exactly 1 week away, plenty of time for all the pieces I'd set in motion to fall into place. We're halfway through this story, and things are about to get intense. Elena has been silent for so long, but silence has been her weapon, not her weakness. What Marcus doesn't know is that his perfect victim has been building a trap around him, one careful step at a time. If you're invested in seeing how this unfolds, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Your support helps me bring more of these narratives to life. Now, let's see what Elena has planned. Behind the scenes, my carefully orchestrated plan was moving forward with precision. Amanda Chen had verified my documents and was preparing an exposé that would publish in the Wall Street Journal the day after Marcus's investor dinner. timing that I'd specifically requested to maximize the E. Impact? David Morrison had opened an official SEC investigation and obtained warrants to freeze Marcus's accounts the moment Amanda's article went live. Sarah Price had filed divorce papers that wouldn't be served until after the article published, but that included detailed allegations of abuse backed by my photographic evidence, recordings, and medical records from the 3 times I'd visited the emergency room with injuries Marcus had caused. She'd also filed for a restraining order that would take effect simultaneously with the divorce papers. And James, brilliant, faithful James, had done something I never could have done alone. Using his industry connections, he'd quietly reached out to Marcus's most recent investors, the ones whose money was still mostly intact, and warned them to pull out immediately. He'd been subtle about it, framing it as market concerns rather than fraud allegations, but the effect was the same. Marcus's latest scheme was hemorrhaging capital, making him desperate and vulnerable right when he needed to appear strongest. On Thursday, 2 days before the dinner party, I withdrew $50,000 from one of the accounts Marcus didn't monitor as closely, an old savings account from before our marriage that I'd kept separate and had slowly been funneling small amounts of money into over the years. It wasn't much compared to Marcus's wealth, but it was enough to start over. Enough to rent an apartment and hire security and rebuild my life. I'd also been in contact with a domestic violence shelter, not because I needed shelter. I had the money for a hotel and ultimately my own place, but because I wanted their advice on safety planning. The counselor I spoke with, a woman named Patricia, had been invaluable in helping me think through every detail of my exit strategy. The most dangerous time is when you leave, Patricia had warned me. He's going to feel his control slipping, and that's when abusers become most violent. You need to be somewhere he can't find you when this all goes down. So I'd arranged that too. On Saturday morning, while Marcus was at the gym, I would pack a single bag and leave. I'd stay at a hotel under a fake name until after the article published, until Marcus was in custody or at least being questioned by the SEC. Sarah had assured me that with the restraining order and the fraud charges, he wouldn't be able to come near me. Friday night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, I would stop being Marcus's victim and become Elena Reeves again. I thought about all the women who would read Amanda's article, who would see themselves in my story. I thought about the investors who'd lost money to Marcus's schemes, who would finally get justice. I thought about the future I was claiming back, the life I would build from the ruins of this nightmare. And I thought about Marcus, completely oblivious to the trap closing around him, already planning how he would spend the money from his biggest deal yet. Money that would never materialize because I had made absolutely certain of that. The best part? He had no idea. None. He was so confident in his control over me, so certain of his own superiority, that it had never occurred to him I might be capable of fighting back. That was his fatal mistake. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that promised change. Marcus was in a good mood, whistling as he got ready for his golf game, already mentally spending the millions he expected to secure at tonight's dinner. "Remember," he said as he headed out the door, 7 o'clock. The Winstons, the Abernathys, and the Chens. These people have serious money, and I need them convinced that the Meridian project is worth their investment. Can you handle that? Or do I need to hire a professional caterer? The casual cruelty in his tone, the implication that I was so incompetent I couldn't even be trusted with a dinner party, would have hurt a week ago. Now, it just rolled off me like water. "I'll handle it," I said meekly. "Everything will be perfect. It better be." He grabbed his golf clubs and left without another word, not even a goodbye. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I sprang into action. I'd already packed my bag days ago. It was hidden in the back of my closet, containing everything I couldn't bear to leave. Behind, photographs from before Marcus, my MIT degree, the thumb drives with all my evidence, and a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother. I carried the bag down to my car, my hands remarkably steady. Then I went back inside and did something that felt both petty and deeply satisfying. I called the caterer Marcus had absolutely forbidden me to hire and arranged for them to deliver and serve a perfect dinner tonight. He'd never know I hadn't cooked it myself, but I'd know, and that was enough. The caterers would arrive at 5 o'clock. I would leave at 4, after setting the table and making the house look perfect one last time. Not because Marcus deserved it, but because I wanted his last memory of me to be exactly what I'd always appeared to be, obedient, meek, and utterly unthreatening, right up until the moment I destroyed him. I spent the morning cleaning, though our house was already immaculate. We had a cleaning service that came twice a week, but I needed to keep moving, needed to burn off the nervous energy thrumming through my body. I arranged flowers in crystal vases, polished silver that was already gleaming, and set the dining room table with our finest china. At noon, Amanda Chen called my burner phone. "The article is scheduled to go live tomorrow at 8 a.m., she said. "Elena, I want you to know this is going to be big. Not just business section big, front page big. Marcus Holloway is about to become the most hated man in financial circles." "Good," I said, and meant it. "The SEC is ready to move too. David Morrison says they'll execute the warrant to freeze his accounts at 8:30, and they've arranged for federal agents to bring Marcus in for questioning by 9. He won't be able to access any of his money or assets. And the restraining order. It'll be served simultaneously with the divorce papers. Sarah has a process server ready to meet him at the SEC office. By the time he understands what's happening, it'll be too late for him to retaliate. He'll try anyway," I said quietly. "He'll want to hurt me." "That's why you need to stay hidden until he's in custody," Amanda reminded me. "Patricia from the shelter is expecting your call once you're secure. She has contacts who specialize in protecting women in your situation." After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long moment, looking around at the house that had been my prison for 5 years. So much money, so much luxury, and all of it meaningless. Because I'd been dying inside these walls. No more. At 4 o'clock, with the table set and the house perfect, I grabbed my bag and walked out the front door for the last time. I didn't look back. I wasn't there for Marcus's dinner party, but Amanda Chen's investigative team was. She'd arranged for a freelance photographer to pose as a guest, someone Marcus didn't know, but whose credentials checked out, invited as a +1 by one of the other investors. He took discreet photos throughout the evening, capturing Marcus in his element, confident, charming, every inch the successful businessman. Amanda sent me the photos later that night, along with a voice memo describing what had happened. I listened to it from my hotel room, a modest but comfortable place 30 miles from the house, registered under a fake name with cash. "He was perfect," Amanda's voice came through my phone speaker. "Charismatic, convincing, every inch the man with the golden touch." He talked about the Meridian project like it was a guaranteed winner, projected returns of 40% within 2 years, minimal risk, exclusive opportunity. The investors were eating it up. Mrs. Winston actually got out her phone to initiate a wire transfer before dinner was even over. But here's the interesting part, Elena. I did some digging into this Meridian project he's pitching. It doesn't exist. I mean, there's a real company called Meridian Tech, but it's a struggling startup that Marcus has no actual connection to. He was literally selling shares in a company he doesn't own, planning to take the investment money and funnel it into his offshore accounts like he's done with every other scheme. This wasn't just fraud anymore. This was getting sloppy, desperate. I think you were right. James's warning to the previous investors has Marcus scrambling for new capital. He's taking bigger risks, cutting corners. If you hadn't stopped him, this would have collapsed on its own within months. You just controlled. How and when it happened? I listened to the recording 3 times, studying the photos. There was Marcus raising a champagne glass in a toast. There he was, laughing at someone's joke. There he was, shaking hands, sealing a deal that would never happen. He looked so confident, so untouchable. He had no idea that in less than 12 hours, his entire world would implode. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt exhausted. 5 years of fear, of walking on eggshells, of making myself smaller and quieter and less threatening just to survive. It all caught up with me at once. I curled up on the hotel bed and cried, not tears of sadness, but of release, of a burden finally lifted. Tomorrow Marcus would face consequences. Tomorrow the world would see him for what he really was. Tomorrow I would be free, but tonight I just needed to rest. Amanda's article went live at exactly 8 a.m. on Sunday morning, and by 8:30 my phone was exploding with notifications, despite being on Do Not Disturb mode. I'd set up a Google alert for Marcus's name, and the results were flooding in faster than I could read them. Venture capitalist Marcus Holloway, accused of running $50 million fraud scheme. Prominent investor faces SEC investigation for wire fraud and money laundering. Marcus Holloway's wife exposes years of abuse and financial crimes. The article itself was devastating. Amanda had done her job brilliantly, laying out every detail of Marcus's schemes with ironclad evidence, including scanned documents, email records, and even some recordings I'd made of Marcus bragging to his friends about how easy it was to fool stupid investors. She'd also included my story, the abuse, the control, the way Marcus had stolen my company and tried to erase my identity. But what really made the article powerful was the human element. Amanda had tracked down 3 of Marcus's victims: a retired couple who'd lost their life savings, a single mother who'd invested her child's college fund, and a young entrepreneur whose startup had been deliberately bankrupted by Marcus's manipulations. Their stories gave faces and names to Marcus's crimes, transforming abstract financial fraud into personal tragedy. By 9 a.m., my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Elena? The voice was male, unfamiliar, and professional. This is Agent David Morrison with the SEC. I wanted to inform you that Marcus Holloway was taken into custody 45 minutes ago. He's currently being questioned at our office, and we've executed warrants to freeze all of his accounts and assets. Based on the evidence you provided, we're confident we have enough to press charges for wire fraud, money laundering, and securities fraud. He's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison. I couldn't speak for a moment. 20 to 30 years. Marcus, who'd controlled every aspect of my life, who'd made me feel small and worthless, who'd hit me and belittled me and nearly destroyed me, he was going to prison. Elena, Morrison's voice came again. Are you there? I'm here, I managed. Thank you. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for coming forward, Morrison replied. The evidence you gathered was some of the most thorough and well-organized documentation of fraud I've seen in my career. You basically did our job for us. If you ever want a career in forensic accounting, give me a call. I laughed, surprising myself. I'll keep that in mind. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a long moment. Then I called Sarah Price. Elena! Her voice was warm with triumph. I assume you've seen the news. I have. Morrison called and said Marcus is in custody. Better than that. He's been denied bail. The judge considered him a flight risk, given his offshore accounts and international connections, and the divorce papers and restraining order were served an hour ago. By the time he gets out of questioning, he won't be able to come anywhere near you, contact you, or access any of the marital assets. What about the house? It's frozen as part of the asset seizure. Everything Marcus owns, or thought he owned, is now subject to the SEC investigation and will eventually be liquidated to pay back his victims. You'll get your share as part of the divorce settlement, but it's going to take time to sort through everything. I don't care about the money, I said honestly. I just want to be free of him. Well, you are, legally, financially, and permanently. Marcus Holloway will never hurt you again. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Marcus's arrest was international news, not just because of the amount of money involved, but because of the human interest angle. The story of an abused wife exposing her husband's crimes captured imaginations. I gave one interview to Amanda Chen, in which I carefully explained that I wasn't a hero, just a survivor who'd gotten lucky and smart. Enough to fight back. The interview went viral. Within days, I was receiving messages from hundreds of women sharing their own stories of abuse and manipulation, thanking me for giving them hope. It was overwhelming and humbling, and occasionally painful to read, but it also made me realize that my suffering hadn't been meaningless. If my story helped even one person find the courage to leave their abuser, then the past 5 years had some purpose. Marcus tried to contact me from jail, phone calls that I refused to accept, letters that Sarah intercepted and documented as violations of the restraining order. In the letters she showed me, he alternated between rage and manipulation, sometimes calling me a lying bitch who'd destroyed his life, sometimes begging me to recant my testimony and help him, claiming he'd always loved me and had only been trying to make me a better person. Reading those letters, I felt nothing but a distant sort of pity. Marcus genuinely couldn't understand what he'd done wrong. In his mind, he was the victim, betrayed by an ungrateful wife who'd conspired against him. He would probably go to his grave believing that. The divorce was finalized in record time. Sarah had never seen a judge move so fast to dissolve a marriage. But then again, the evidence was overwhelming. I got a small settlement, enough to be comfortable, but nowhere near what Marcus had been worth before his crimes were exposed. Most of his assets went to reimbursing his fraud victims, which was exactly what I'd wanted. But the real victory wasn't financial. The real victory was the day I walked into James's office and signed papers making me a partner in his company. "Welcome back to the tech world, Elena," James said, shaking my hand. "We've missed you." He'd created a new division specifically for me, one focused on developing ethical financial algorithms that prioritized transparency and investor protection. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I was using the skills Marcus had tried to erase to build systems that would prevent people like him from succeeding. "I have a name for the division," I said. "Helios Analytics." James grinned. "Perfect." The new Helios Analytics launched 3 months later with funding from several major financial institutions and a mission statement that explicitly mentioned my experience with Marcus as motivation. We developed algorithms that could detect patterns of financial fraud, software that made investment details more transparent to everyday investors, and educational programs teaching people how to protect themselves from schemes like Marcus's. Within a year, we had contracts with the SEC and several major banks. Within 2 years, we'd prevented an estimated $300 million in investment fraud. We were saving people from the kind of pain Marcus had caused, and it felt like redemption. 3 years after Marcus's arrest, I stood in front of a packed auditorium at a women's technology conference, preparing to give a keynote speech about resilience and reinvention. I was wearing a dress I'd chosen myself, not the designer labels Marcus had preferred, but something comfortable and professional that made me feel confident. My hair was shorter now, cut in a style that felt like me rather than like Mrs. Marcus Holloway. And when I looked in the mirror these days, I recognized the woman staring back. "Thank you for having me," I began, looking out at the sea of faces. "My name is Elena Reeves, and I'm here to tell you a story about losing yourself and finding your way back." I talked about my journey, not in lurid detail, but honestly. I talked about being a young entrepreneur with big dreams, about falling in love with someone who slowly eroded my identity, about the years I spent as a shadow of myself. And then I talked about fighting back, about the moment I decided that surviving wasn't enough, that I deserved to thrive. "The thing about abuse," I said, "is that it teaches you to make yourself smaller, quieter, less threatening. You learn to apologize for taking up space, for having opinions, for existing. And even after you escape, even after you're physically safe, undoing that psychological damage takes time. For months after I left Marcus, I would catch myself apologizing for things that didn't need apologies. I'd hesitate before speaking in meetings, afraid of saying the wrong thing. I'd question my own judgment on decisions I was absolutely qualified to make. Because that's what abuse does. It rewires your brain to doubt yourself constantly. But here's what I learned. You are not what was done to you. You are not your worst moments or your biggest mistakes. You are not the lies your abuser told you about yourself. You are whoever you choose to become after you survive. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. I chose to become Elena Reeves again. Not the woman I was before Marcus, because you can't go backward, but a new version, stronger, wiser, more compassionate toward others and toward myself. And I chose to use my experience to help others, to build something meaningful from the wreckage of my marriage. So if you're watching this and you're trapped in a situation like I was, know this: you are not alone, you are not crazy, you are not overreacting, and you are stronger than you think. The very fact that you're still here, still fighting, still hoping for better, that's proof of your strength. And to anyone who's already escaped, who's rebuilding their life, be patient with yourself. Healing isn't linear. Some days you'll feel invincible, and some days you'll wonder if you made a mistake leaving. That's normal. That's human. Keep going anyway. Because here's the secret they don't tell you about surviving abuse. The revenge isn't just about bringing your abuser to justice, though that's important. The real revenge is becoming so undeniably, unapologetically yourself that you erase every lie they ever told you about your worth. The real revenge is building a life so full of purpose and joy that they become irrelevant to your story. Marcus tried to erase Elena Reeves, but Elena Reeves is standing here today, thriving. And he's in a prison cell where he belongs. That's my revenge, and it's sweeter than anything I could have imagined. The applause was deafening. Epilogue. 5 years later. 5 years after Marcus's conviction, I stood in the lobby of Helios Analytics' new headquarters, a sleek glass building in downtown San Francisco with stunning views of the bay. The company had grown beyond anything James or I had imagined, employing over 300 people and generating enough revenue to fund a non-profit foundation dedicated to helping domestic violence survivors start their own businesses. I was CEO now. James had stepped back to focus on research, saying that the company needed someone with my specific vision and experience to lead it forward. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but I'd learned to trust myself again, to believe that I was capable of handling whatever challenges came my way. Marcus was still in prison. He'd been convicted on 17 counts of fraud and sentenced to 28 years. He would be eligible for parole eventually, but by then he'd be an old man with a criminal record that would prevent him from ever working in finance again. Sometimes I wondered if he'd learned anything from his downfall. If he'd ever truly understood what he'd done wrong. Probably not. People like Marcus rarely do, but I didn't think about him much anymore. He'd taken enough of my life already. I refused to give him any more of my mental energy. Instead, I thought about the women we'd helped through our foundation. Women like Maria, a software engineer who'd escaped an abusive marriage and used our grant program to start a tech consulting firm that now employed a dozen other survivors. Or like Jasmine, a graphic designer who'd been told by her ex-husband that she was too stupid to run a business, who now ran a successful design agency and spoke at conferences about entrepreneurship and resilience. These were the stories that mattered. These were the victories that counted. On my desk in my corner office, I kept 2 photographs. One was from my MIT graduation, me at 24, full of hope and ambition, ready to conquer the world. The other was from last year's Women's Technology Conference, me at 38, scarred but stronger, Wiser but still optimistic, surrounded by other women whose stories of survival and triumph echoed my own. Different women, same determination. I'd come full circle, but not back to where I started. I'd spiraled upward, taking everything I'd learned from my darkest hours and transforming it into something meaningful. The Elena Reeves, who'd sold her company to please her boyfriend, was gone. The Mrs. Marcus Holloway, who'd cowered in fear, was gone too. The woman who remained was someone entirely new, forged in fire, tempered by pain, and ultimately unbreakable. And that was my real victory. Not the money, not the success, not even the satisfaction of seeing Marcus behind bars. The real victory was reclaiming myself, proving that I was more than what had been done to me, becoming someone who could help others find their own path, from victim to survivor to thriver. As I looked out over the city from my office window, watching the sun set over the bay, I thought about all the women who would read my story or hear my speeches. I thought about the messages I still received weekly from survivors, thanking me for giving them hope. I thought about the lives we'd changed through our work at Helios Analytics and our foundation. And I realized something profound. Marcus had tried to destroy me, but instead he'd given me a purpose. His cruelty had shown me exactly what kind of person I never wanted to be. His abuse had taught me the value of genuine kindness and respect. His attempts to erase my identity had forced me to rebuild myself into someone stronger than I'd ever been before. He'd wanted to break me. Instead, he'd remade me into someone who could help break the cycle for others. That was irony. That was justice. And that was my happily ever after, not a fairy tale ending, but something real and hard-won and infinitely more valuable. I was Elena Reeves. I was a survivor. I was a fighter. And I was finally, completely, undeniably free. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think, if it gave you hope or strength or courage, please share it. There are too many people out there suffering in silence, believing they're alone, thinking there's no way out. Let this story be a reminder that darkness doesn't last forever, that silence can be a weapon, and that the person you've been forced to become is never the person you have to remain. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and most importantly, if you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, reach out for help. You deserve better. You deserve safety. You deserve a life where you can be wholly, completely yourself. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. You are not alone. You are believed. And you are worthy of love, respect, and freedom. Thank you for watching Elena's story. Until next time, remember, your past does not define your future. Your worst moments do not determine your worth, and the person you're becoming is always more important than the person you were forced to be. See you in the next story.